everybody, and thank you for coming to this talk. My name is Roberto, and I'm a software engineer at ARM. Today's talk will be a combined talk. Carl and I will talk about optimizing mobile games, but from a different perspective. I will talk from the perspective of a developer, and I will go through the main highlights of the ARM guide to Unity. Then I will introduce the concept of the local human, and I will talk about how to implement reflections and shadows very efficiently and with high quality based on local human. The rendering shadow technique I will explain today, which is based on local human, has been recently developed at ARM and is completely new, a new technique. Finally, Carl will talk from the perspective of the game platform, which is used by more than a half of developers all over the world. As you know, recently at GDC San Francisco last month, Unity 5 was released. Developers were waiting with a great expectation this release of Unity, and Carl will talk today about some of the most important improvements in Unity 5. So let me start this talk with short notes about the ARM Guide to Unity. The ARM Guide to Unity is a project that started from the student industrial placement that was working at our team, the demo team at ARM, for almost a year. And when we were in the middle of the project, we decided to put in the guide our experience when learning Unity from the scratch. So last year, during Unite Seattle, we released the ARM Guide to Unity for the first time. This guide is available for free for downloading from the Mali developer website. Developing games for mobile is a real challenge due to the specifics when compared with PCs and consoles. So this is the reason why the guide, the most content of the guide is related with how optimizing mobile games for optimizing games for the mobile platform. So you can find in the guide how to optimize your game, how to find bottlenecks and fight against them. But there is also a large list of optimizations you can find there to make the most of our games when running in mobile devices. But there is also some chapter devoted to more advanced rendering techniques, which is devoted to more advanced Unity developers. This chapter covers part of the talk I will give today. This chapter talks about reflection based on local humors. But now this project is getting more ambitious. We are keeping the goal of providing solutions to more common problems when developers start to learn Unity. But we want to add more advanced content. We want to add content related with optimized rendering techniques for when writing games for mobile platforms. The next update of the guide will be at Unite Europe in June at Netherlands. So this update of the guide will include the source code and detailed explanation of the techniques I will talk about today, and other rendering techniques related with the implementation of high-quality reflections based on local human, which is a new technique also developed at ARM very recently. How to use enlighten in your custom shaders. You know that enlighten is the global illumination solution that is built in Unity. And you will be able to find in this update of the guide how to use and light in your custom shaders. So let me start with the main content of my talk, which is related with implementing reflections and shadows based on local kill maps. I will go first through the concept of local kill maps. I will show you how to implement high quality and efficient reflections based on local kill maps, which is a technique available for more than 10 years, but I think that we developers haven't paid enough attention to this technique, especially which is important, especially when developing games for mobile platforms. And once we've gone through the concept of local kill map and how to use them in implementing reflections, I will explain this new rendering, shadow rendering technique that we have developed at ARM recently. I will explain the fundamentals of this technique and how to use it at runtime to implement very efficient and high quality shadows. And finally, I will make it dry the top. So, developers, shadows and reflections and shadows are everywhere in the real world, and we want them in our games. From the very beginning, developers have been trying to find efficient methods to implement reflections. When the cube maps were introduced in 1999, developers started to use them widely for implementing reflections. Using cube maps in reflections is really simple and straightforward. You just need to get the normal to the reflected surface, and in that expression, you need to build your view vector, V in that expression, and then you can find your reflection vector. And then using your reflection vector, you can fetch the texture from the cube map using the available texture fetching function, and we get the color of the reflection at a given fragment. This technique works pretty fine when we are dealing with reflections coming from a distant environment, for example, from the sky. But let's see what happens if we want to use this simple technique to render reflections in a local environment, an environment like this. And let's think about this following hypothetical situation. You are walking in one of the many corridors at the Twice Mall Center, which is practically pretty reflective surface, perfect reflective surface. You're walking there, keeping constant the angle you're looking to the floor. In this case, if we keep it constant, our view vector, and if we are walking on the reflective surface, which is planar, our normal vector n will be constant all over the surface. So both those magnitudes are constant, then our reflected vector is constant. So we get, no matter where we are, the same reflection vector, and when we are fetching the texture from the cube map, we always get the same reflection. If we use this approach, this is what we get. Camera is moving along its reflective surface, keeping constant the view vector, and what happens? We are getting always over and over the same reflection. So what is failing there? The point is that that expression, we don't have any connection, any binding with the local geometry. So this is the reason why if we want to apply this standard cube map to the local reflections, we get wrong reflection. The solution to this problem is known for more than 10 years. But as I said at the beginning, we as developers, I think, haven't paid enough attention to it. how this problem can be solved. So we introduce a proxy geometry, in this case a bounding box, that will delimit the volume of our scene where the reflections take place. And instead of using the reflected vector straightforward to fetch the texture from the cube map, we will find the intersection of our reflection vector with the proxy geometry. In that case, the point, red point P. And we will build a new vector from the position where the cube map was generated to this intersection point. We will build a new vector CP. And then we call that vector R prime to distinguish from the reflection vector. And then we will use that new vector to fetch the texture from the cube map. And let's see what happens if we apply this local correction to the reflection vector. I will show you in this short video from the small demo we prepared for this meeting. And you will be able also to see that demo working, and you can play with it at our booth, at our booth in the exposition floor. So at the left, we can see the reflections when applying the local correction that I just explained. At the right, just for comparison, is the wrong reflections we get when we try to use just the cube map as it is for rendering reflections. As you can see, in the left side, we are showing the right reflections. As the camera moves, the reflection changes. It's not the same at the right, where the reflection is just practically static. Why? Because everything is constant in that expression. So at this point, we must clearly distinguish between two types of cube maps. Infinite cube maps or standard cube maps, and local cube maps. We use infinite cube maps when we are dealing with reflections coming from a distant environment, for example, from the sky. We use local cube maps when we are dealing with reflections in a local environment. So in that case, we need to apply the local correction, and we need to consider where the position where the cube map was generated, because it is part of the algorithm. You need to handle the position of the cube map to build that new vector that you will finally use to fetch the correct texture from the cube map. Another important advantage from this method is the fact that the cube map is static. So the cube map is built of lines rather than actual time. So it allows us to apply any type of filtering, no matter its complexity, no matter how much time it takes to achieve a given effect on the reflection. In this case, we have applied a Gaussian filter, simple Gaussian filter, to the cube map to achieve frosty effect on the reflections, on the reflected surface. And you can see. So this is the result of applying Gaussian filter to the cube map. Thanks to the fact we can do that without using runtime resources, because this cube map is static. But this fact, which is an advantage for some things, is also a disadvantage. It's also a problem if we are rendering reflections in a local environment where we got dynamic objects. As the cube map is built of line spread base, this cube map will not consider correctly the reflection from objects which are dynamic, which are changing their position in the scene, or which are changing their shapes or their geometry. So the cube map will not reflect correctly this situation. So how we can handle this problem, which is a real problem if you think about that. So the solution is just to combine the reflection from static geometry using the local cube map approach, and combine this reflection from the static geometry with reflections from dynamic objects rendered for example, picture. So the reflection from the chess pieces, which are dynamic objects, are rendered at runtime to a texture which is then projected onto the chessboard. The reflections coming from the walls of the room, from the ceiling, are rendered using the local Kuhlmann techniques that I have explained before. And the reflection you can see everywhere, and the chess pieces are also in the chessboard, which are reflecting the sky. They are rendered using the infinite Kuhlmanns, so the standard Kuhlmann, the simplest technique for rendering reflections with Kuhlmanns. So at this point that we've seen the concept of local Kuhlmanns and how local Kuhlmann can be used for rendering reflections, I would like to introduce this new technique I talked about at the beginning of the talk for rendering shadows using local Kuhlmanns. This is a completely new technique we have developed at the demo team Radar, and we call dynamic soft shadows based on local Kuhlmanns. I will explain in the talk the main points of this technique in such a way you will be able to implement in your shaders. And I will explain why we say that the shadows we get using this new technique, they are dynamic and they are soft. The main idea of this technique is divided into two stages. In the first stage, we render into the alpha channel of the Kuhlmann the transparency of the scene. We can use the same Kuhlmann we use for reflection, and we can use that Kuhlmann for shadows, because reflections use the RGB channels, the color channel of the Kuhlmann. And we would use here the alpha channel in such a way that when rendering the Kuhlmann, we first place the Kuhlmann in the middle of the volume, and we render the Kuhlmann in all directions, up, down, right, left, from back. And we render the transparency of the scene in such a way that where there is an opaque geometry, we render into the alpha channel a value 1. And where there is no geometry, for example, in the windows there, or the geometry is totally transparent, we render 0 there in the alpha channel. And where the geometry is semi-transparent, we render an intermediate value. At this point, we are not using any information from the light. So this stage of the process is independent of the light position, and it is independent of the number of light, which is a really relevant part of the technique. The second stage of the technique happens at runtime. So at runtime, in the vertex shader, we build a vector from the vertex to the light source. And we pass that vector as a varying to the fragment shader. When we are passing that vector to the fragment shader as a varying, it is interpolated. And we get in the fragment shader an already interpolated vector from the fragment to the light. And then we apply the local correction to this vector. So we find the intersection of this vector with the proxy geometry. And we build a new vector from the position where the Kuhlmann was generated to that intersection point, in this case, CQ, CP. And we use that new vector, this local corrected vector, to fetch the texture from the Kuhlmann. But in this case, we are interested only in the value of the alpha channel. If when retrieving the value of the alpha channel, we get 1, it means that in the direction of that vector, the geometry is completely opaque. So we get there that this pixel is shadow. If when receiving the value from the cube map and looking at the alpha value of the texture, we get the value of 0, it means that in the direction of that vector, there is a completely transparent geometry of the isometric. It means that the light can reach that pixel, and that pixel is fixed. As you can see, it is really simple to understand the principle, and it's really simple to implement it, because we are talking about just passing to the fragment shader just a vector, applying in the fragment shader a local correction to the vector, and making one vector from the texture. The complete source code of this technique and the same explanation will be in the next update of the guide, as I said at the beginning of the class. And this is the kind of shadows we get when we implement our technique for rendering shadows in a local environment. You can see that the shadows are really nice. And we say that these shadows, this technique can produce dynamic shadows, because if we pass to the shader the position of the light as a uniform, it will be, when the light changes the position, it will be the vector from the vertex, in the vertex shader, the vector from the vertex to the light position will be updated automatically, and everything will be, the shadow will follow the real position of the light and will produce automatically the correct shadows for a given position of the light, and accordingly to the geometry of the room, in this case, the light is passing through the windows. But the most important point here is that the same type of shadow with this quality and this automatic update of shadows, this dynamic shadows, will take place for any number of lights. You just need to follow the same procedure for every light source. To build the vector from the vertex to the light, to pass that vector to the fragment shader, apply the local correction, and fetch the texture from the cube map. So I'm showing here in this short video how it works. The light is changing the position, the slider at the left is just changing the light position, and look at immediately the shadows are updated, shadows are following the light. If we will have another light there, we will get the same, just following the same procedure in our shaders. Another important property of the shadows that our technique can reproduce is the softness of the shadows. Our technique can produce the penumbra shadows. This property of the shadows is related with the fact that the farther from the object that generates the softness, the softer the shadows that we, in the real life, we can see. So as we are getting out, we're getting farther from the object that creates the shadows, we get more blue, more soft shadows. And our technique is able to reproduce that. And the most important fact is can do it in a very simple way, in a very smart way. How we can do that? So instead of fetching the texture, just using the default zero minmap level of the cube map, when rendering the cube map, we will also produce the cube map minmaps. And then, instead of fetching the texture using the zero minmap level, we will pass to the fetching cube map function a factor, a magnitude which is proportional to the length of the vector from the fragment to the intersection point in the proxy geometry. I wrote there a factor because we will use that factor to tweak and change it at one time to show you how the softness of the shadows change when we are changing the level of the tape we are using to flex the texture. So in practice, we are interpolating between different minimal levels when we are changing that magnitude, which is proportional of the distance from the pixel to the intersection point. And this is what we get. Now, look at the right, we are changing the slider. When changing the slider, we are changing that factor that we use an expression for indicate which minimal level we are fetching. And you can see how the softness of the shadow changes accordingly. And it can reproduce perfectly. The shadows which are nearer to the windows, they are very sharp. And the shadows which are farther away from the object that generate greater shadows, in this case the windows, the shadows are more blue and more soft. So we can say that our technique can render dynamic and soft shadows. So at this point we can summarize the benefits of our technique. As you have seen, this technique is really simple to implement. It involves just a few operations in a shaders and one fetching. That fetching can be used for shadows and reflections. So we can combine these shadows with reflections. I will show you later in a short video. We can push high quality shadows, and this is a very important point. This is a very important advantage of this method. Because when you are rendering, when you are using the classical approach to render shadows at one time using the shadow mapping technique, you always will get some pixel instability, some pixel flickering when the camera is moving. But you will not get that here, because we are fetching the texture from start to and our shadows will be perfect, will be super stable. Another advantage we've seen is the fact that the cube map is static, so we can apply any type of filtering beforehand to get any visual effect on the reflections. I showed you before the result of applying, for example, Gaussian filter. And last, I will also mention the fact that when we are using the proxy geometry, this bounded box, we are, in fact, what we are trying is to simplify the geometry of our scene to find easily the intersection of the vector with that proxy geometry. So we are considering our scene as an approximation to the bounding box. And this is the same we do in the reflections. But when we are dealing with reflections, if our scene, the shape of our scene is far, the farther away is the shape of the scene from the geometry of the bounding box of the box, our reflection will start to get deformed. But in the case of shadows, this technique is very tolerant of deviation from the bounding box shape of our scene. Our scene can be a lot different from a bounding box, and we're still getting very nice shadows. And you will be able to see if you come to our booth in the demo. And I will also show you just a few minutes after a short video of our demo. But this point, the fact that the cube map is static and we're treating this as an advantage, is also a big disadvantage. Why? Because, as I said before, for the case of reflections, when we are trying to render shadows using this local cube map technique, using static cube map, we will not be able to render the shadows of objects which are changing their position. This technique is not able to render, of course, the shadows from dynamic objects. And how we can solve this equation? So we follow the same approach as reflection. We just combine this technique with already existing technique, shadow mapping, to render shadows from dynamic objects. So in a scene where we've got static geometry and we've got dynamic objects, so we render the shadow from the static geometry using this new technique developed at ARM. We combine those shadows with a shadow rendered at runtime, for example, using the shadow mapping technique to get a single picture common of all shadows in our scene. And in this short video, I'm showing how we can combine shadows from static geometry, from a static environment, with shadow rendered at runtime. In this case, the chess pieces are dynamic objects, and the shadows are rendered every frame at runtime, rendered the texture, and the texture is projected onto the chessboard. And also you can see on the floor how when we are moving on the floor, that chess piece right now, how it is combined both types of shadows. And you also can notice, if you look carefully, that the shadows rendered at runtime, they are not stable. In the border of the shadow, you will be able to see this pixel frequent instability, which is a limitation of the technique, the shadow mapping technique. But in the case of the shadows we render using our technique, the shadows from the static geometry, they're just perfect. They're just very, very super stable. So wrapping up what we've seen so far, we can say that reflection and shadow based on local field model, both techniques we've seen so far, are resource-saving techniques that work very well for mobile devices, where resources must be carefully balanced at runtime. These techniques can be also effectively combined with other existing techniques to render reflections and shadows from dynamic objects. And finally, I would like to invite you to come to our booth to check yourself how these techniques, reflections and shadows based on local field models, are combined to produce really, really nice visual effects in the ice skate demo, where you will be able to see other different special effects as fog, light shaft, procedural skybox, also a lighting used in a very specific way in our custom shaders. All shaders are custom in this case, because we are in this demo we are rendering many effects with the highest quality in a mobile device. I would like to finally highlight that all the information I'm providing today will be available in the next release of the ARM guide to Unity. That the next update of the guide will be publicly available at Unite Europe in Netherlands. And now I just will run a short video of the ice skate demo. You will be, if you come to our booth, and I encourage you to do that, you will see this demo. You will be able to interact because the demo is interactive. It is an ice skate where practically all surfaces are reflected, everything are reflecting everything. Reflections are based on local cube maps. Shadows are based on local cube maps, and they are combined. Shadows from static geometry are combined with shadows from dynamic objects. And lighting is used for the illumination of part of the scene in the crystals. We also are rendering semi-transparent tiger. We are rendering their refractions based on local cube maps, also new technique developed at ARM. We are rendering light shaft, bloom effects, very sophisticated effects with high quality. everything on a mobile platform. So this is all that I wanted to talk about today, and now I will hand over to Carl, and he will talk about the several really important improvements that have been implemented in Unity 5. One of them is related with the reflection based on local humans. Sorry, wait, this is done.
Okay, so what we see is here, Alan Carl. Okay. 안녕하세요. Sorry. So what we quickly discuss and show you here is how Roberto created technology that we actually use that to make it easy for you. Raising hands who has been using Unity 5 already. Okay, Roberto. Okay. You should download it and start to use it. Okay. So what we see is here is a little environment. Okay. With the sky. Okay. What we see is also emissive materials. We see the light coming in, bouncing around. What we also see is a really reflective bazooka. And when I walk around, the reflection moves with it. What are we going to do? We're going to take the project from Unity 4 and upgrade it to Unity 5. So, go here. This is how we look at Unity 4. So the first thing in Unity 5, you have a skybox. The light from the skybox will create ambient lighting in your scene. So look here. Right now, it's set to just the color of the sky. Let's change it to the skybox. Click, drag it in. We have the sky, but it doesn't contribute yet. How do you do it? Click the button. Click, we will use the sky. Click. And right away you see that the skybox is contributing to the ambient lighting. Let's pick another sky. Okay, let's go with this one here. Click, you see the right away differences. Okay, let's select the skybox here. And now the exposure we can change. Good. But also the rotation. And see, when I rotate it, the update of the light. Pretty impressive, eh? Yes. So, put it here. Go back to my lighting here. I will turn off the ambient lighting. Fully turn off. We have a directional light here in the scene. Look here what we can do. Then we can turn it off. We can turn it off just like in Unity 4 did before. But here's the power now. Look here. The bounce intensity. We can real-time bounce the light around in the scene. Okay. So look here. Now, and here. You can actually see it like this. In here. And the iridescence. And now you can see if you contribute direct, indirect lighting. No indirect lighting. There I can see nicely the indirect lighting in real time. Go back to the shaded mode. There we have it. Beautiful. Let's add back our ambient lighting. Ambient lighting. There we have it nicely combined. The power of real-time bouncing lighting and the skybox that contributes put it in aided lighting. Okay. Physical-based shaders. Okay. Our material shaders. It makes it super easy for you to make it realistic, to integrate objects in the scene that feel alive here, because they absorb the light and bounce off the light. Look here, this bazooka, this model. In the inspector, it is set to legacy material, the Unity 4 material. Let's change it to standard material. Click. See if this changes, but no, here, look here. We have a normal map, fine, it's a slider. You can be lazy with it. Tweak it with the sliding. What's here powerful, we have here the metallic map. Look, you can bring up the metallic, and it's dark. Don't worry. Here the lighting, we can bring in the reflection intensity. So, now we have the reflection. When I move forward, and I press play, you can see nicely the reflections on the bazooka. Wow. But I don't see the reflections of the environment. When I walk, nothing happens. Who do I blame? Roberto. Roberto fixed it for us. Let's show you. What we're going to do, and this is really beautiful, we're going to create here a reflection probe. Okay. We take a sample of the reflection here, and everything in that cube will use that reflection. Okay, let's play it. Okay. When I move forward now, nothing happens, but I use the reflection of that cube. Then I walk outside the cube, it's using again the default skybox as a reflection. Okay, let's go continue here. You will see the power very soon. Let me duplicate that one. Okay, place it here. And we're going to adjust this, the area. Okay. Okay, we're going to adjust it. Okay. So look now. I have here two reflection probes. And they overlap. Press play. I walk. And I blend to the other reflection probe. Impressive. But what Roberto made me clear is this. It's a very funny story. I went to our headquarters and asked, what is the cube box here, this button do? This box projection. Nobody knew the answer. So I didn't know how to do so, I never showed it. Until Roberto really showed the power of it and explained, when you move it forward, when you move things, it will take basically ray trace and apply that. Look now, here's the power. I click on this, projection is better now. Look now, press play, and now the reflection is moving. So this comes at a minimal cost because the two reflection probes are baked, and at runtime there's no cost. You just blend between those projection and move. So now you have really the feeling this is really nicely integrated. And now we want to make a little bit more fun here. Look here. So we have the reflection probe, so we have the directional light bouncing around, we have the aided lighting. But we want to also have those light boxes here, boost light around in the scene. Okay. Thanks to the static shader, you have here emissive materials. What you have to do, be lazy. Just drag the slider up, and there we have it. You have nice materials. Okay? Now, the final result is, the press play, reflection cubes are working, and the reflection probes. I have a light bouncing around, and now I can walk around here and play the game. So, basically have the final result here. Okay. We have exactly achieved what it is. We know we can put our enemies in there. that also use the reflection probes that will come after me, and they're hasta la vista. Okay. Okay. That was a quick overview how you can actually use a tool that Roberto explained. Super simple by clicking buttons into Unity and apply for you. And this gives you the ability to really boost the quality of your game, stand out in the community with graphics powerful games. Okay, I want to thank you. 감사합니다. Roberto and I will be here for questions. It's one soju per question. So I want 100 questions. Don't be afraid.
Come on, guys.
That's real.
Have you understand the principle we have been talking about today? Will you be able to implement this kind of technique in your shaders or use Unity as Carl explained? Do you like these techniques? Do you? Yeah? Yeah, oh, there is a question there.
오픈월드 같이 아주 큰 맵일 경우에 맵이 굉장히 큰 경우에 지역적 큐브 맵을 많이 만들어야 그것들이 다 적용이 될 것 같은데 그렇게 맵이 큰 오픈월드 타입일 때는 어떤 식으로 이걸 활용할 수 있어요?
The question. No, I'm in the translation because I start listening to it. Okay, the question is what happens if we want to apply these techniques in a huge environment? So, these techniques, as the name said, we use a local correction. So, no matter if your room is big, you can make a single cube map from the room and use a high resolution cube map for that. But if you want, you could also use the same technique as Carl was explaining. You can make several cube maps around. And when you are moving in the scene, you can blend the effect from one cube map to another. But we are talking here about some local reflections and local shadows, which are taking place in some limited volume of your scene, not in an infinite scene. If you want to deal with reflections from an infinite environment, so you use infinite cube maps. You don't need to use any local reflection. Have I answered your question?
촘촘한 건물이 쌓여져 있는 그런 도시, 오픈월드 도시 같은 타입에서는 건물과 건물 사이들이 이렇게 많이 이어져 있는 그런 맵이라고 했을 때 결국에 그런 상황에서 로컬 큐브 맵을 이용해서 그걸 전부 다 적용을 하기에는 많은 큐브 맵들이 소모가 되지 않을까요?
So the question is what happens if we have a city, narrow street, a lot of buildings, large street, and we want to implement, for example, the reflection. This is already, I'm adding something to the question. We want to implement reflection, for example, in a wet asphalt. Or we want to implement reflections of an object which is moving along these long corridors in the quite small. It's the same situation. Yeah, if you need to implement reflection in a large environment, So you need several Puma. But no problem. You make them. Right now, you will be able to, if you're seeing, if you're the space where your Puma will be baked, so you will need to bake different Puma along the street or along the corridor, and you will need to blend from one Puma to another as you are passing from the influence, the volume of where the Puma was baked from one to another. Yeah, you will need to bake several Puma if you want to apply this technique. But you don't need, in this case, high resolution Puma. Will be enough to bake a long rest Puma and then apply to the Puma a kind of blur. You will see the reflections a little blur. Because in the real life, you don't get perfect reflections. You get perfect reflections only in the mirror. You are looking to every morning when you're shaving or your stuff, or making up, things like that. Yeah.
Turn on the screen. Yeah. Hello? You hear me? Yeah? No? Yes? Can you turn on the screen for a second? Okay, so look here. Well, Roberto talked about the fact that an object that's reflective 100% does not exist, not even a mirror. So look here. In this case, you could be a little bit more smooth like this, okay? That would be more reality. No, if I go to the reflection probe, in close to 1, exactly what Roberto talks about. It's a little bit, but in reality, it's baked. But no, that's why if I don't go to 256, I don't see any difference. If I go to 128, okay, there's no need to do super high-res reflection probes. It's real super reflective, that does not exist. No, however, when I work in production, when I make something, and I want to make objects reflective, I put them first to fully high reflective, because I just want to see if everything is correct. And then I put the smooth, the roughness on it, and I reduce the cube map reflection settings. And that way, it looks perfect, and it's really good for runtime performance, even on mobile. Yeah. That's it.
Any other questions, guys? Come on. I want to hear questions from you.
Let's go now.
Yeah. But if there is any more questions, I would like to thank you for coming to this talk. And I invite you to come to the ARM booth tomorrow and play with those demos that I have shown today, the ice skate demo and the chess room demo, where you will be able to play with it and see the quality of reflections and shadows we have implemented in our demo.
And also, big thank you to our partner, ARM, for sponsoring, but also supporting our technology. So, big thank you for ARM. Thank you.